and welcome to week 2 of the fall broadcast series we're doing. My name is Ranger Bailey, and I'm here with Ranger Stiles.
Howdy. We
are out here at Dickey Ridge Visitor Center for our broadcast today. And as you can see, it's a little bit green out here, but we're very excited to see the color progression throughout the fall. And we're going to be doing this throughout all of the fall. We're going to be here Thursday at noon. So if you're interested in any updates, just Shenandoah National Park, or about the leaves, definitely remember to come every Thursday at noon, Facebook or YouTube. And if you have an interest in the fall or the colors of leaves and how that all happens, we just produced a video about all of that. I mean, it's a kind of lengthy video, but if you're really interested, that's also on our Facebook and YouTube, and there's chapters in there. So if you have a particular question about the fall that you just need answered, you can hover over that little bar at the bottom and you'll be able to find what you need. Jumping right in to some other things, we've got a gallery up on our website. If you go onto the main page, you'll be able to find a fall little box about fall, and that'll take you to another page where we have a gallery where we are updating what the colors of the leaves look like right now. We've got some amazing volunteer photographers who are taking their time to get some beautiful pictures this year. Maybe some of our best I think we've ever had, recording what the progression looks like. So if you ever want to just see what the park's looking like right now, that's another great resource. And as for the rest of this broadcast, if you have any questions for me or later on for Ranger Stiles, we'll have our comments open and I'll be reviewing them during the broadcast. But if there's something that we can't answer while we're here, we're always going to be looking later to make sure we can answer those questions for you. Some other things we've got going on in the park that aren't quite fall related is our citizen science project. We're keeping our eye out for those spotted lanternflies. And we've got QR codes also on our Facebook page and also throughout the park. So if you are keeping an eye out, then you can always record them. However, that project ends the 30th, so only in a couple of days. So report those when you see them when you can. And also related to September, it's Wilderness Month, or yes, it is Wilderness Month. And the Wilderness Act of 1964 was signed on September 3rd, and it is made to protect and preserve wilderness. It's managed by the National Park Service, Bureau of Land Management, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Forest Service. So it's a very big DOI and other department projects. So talking a little bit about wilderness, I'm going to jump in and talk a little bit more to Kevin with us today. And Kevin is our expert on everything wilderness. So, Kevin, how would you define wilderness?
So, we have a formal definition by law through the Wilderness Act, but at the end of the day, wilderness is something that I think is somewhat relative to different people. If you're from a big city, never been out in the wildlife, just going out into the woods might just be wilderness to you. Mm-hmm. But here at the Park Service, we do have 5 characteristics, as defined by the Wilderness Act, that kind of make something wilderness. The first one is untrammeled. Now, that's probably a little bit of a weird word for most people. That's not something they've heard. When they think of wilderness, they're probably thinking untrampled or pristine. But untrammeled kind of recognizes that, for the most part, there's no place on Earth that hasn't had some contact with people of some kind in history. And so it's something that we kind of try to do in these things where we try to marry the romantic ideas about wilderness with the practical. And so if you read the act itself, you'll see a lot of kind of qualitative language, a lot of hedges, so mostly undisturbed or largely free from human influence. And so untrammeled is kind of a reflection of that. Man's will is not present or not master of the land, but and nature's forces are allowed to go, but still recognizing that people are going to be present in this land and have always been present. The second characteristic is undeveloped, and that's kind of a little bit more straightforward. That's where we are not having our structures and immediately made masters of the land. So the visitor center right over here. or, say, a road. These are going to be the kind of developments that kind of damage that wilderness characteristic. If you ever look at a map of Shenandoah National Park, you'll see there's large wilderness areas and these little thin lines running through them. Those are the roads, and they can't, because of the act, be wilderness. The third characteristic is going to be natural. Now, natural is going to be a little bit on the finicky side. Basically, it just means communities of plants and animals allowed to exist in an ecological environment and going through their processes over time. But how far back does that go? You know, if you have a lawn that you've allowed to grow out for a couple weeks, is that wilderness? No. But that amount of time is something that's kind of a judgment, kind of something that we kind of decide of over time. The fourth characteristic is going to be an opportunity for solitude and primitive and unconfined recreation. So that unconfined is kind of telling us, you know, to what we can and can't regulate. Of course, primitive, pretty simple. You don't want a hotel out in the wilderness, so it gives you an opportunity to be kind of have that being apart from civilization, but being a part of nature. And then solitude, pretty self-explanatory. We created these spaces to have an opportunity to be introspective, commune with nature. And then lastly, other features of note. Again, this is a recognition that humans are always going to be a part of the landscape. And so if there is a human structure that we consider to be important, like say a famous person's home or a battlefield or something like that, we may preserve that because the value lost by getting rid of it to try and create a more natural space, that's not the kind of balance we want. But, you know, if it's an older structure, we have a dozen of them, it's not really emblematic of anything, we may let that degrade or be torn down to allow nature to reclaim that space.
Okay.
So those are the 5 characteristics.
Quite a bulky characteristic list, but it makes sense with the wording that you used. I think breaking that down makes it very relatable. Why did we have the Wilderness Act of 1964?
So this is a culmination of a movement that, depending on how you look at it, you could say goes back for more than a century. So the Industrial Revolution, of course, begins in the 18th century, and then you've got the Romantics and the Transcendentalists in the early 19th century that are kind of reacting to that.
Yeah.
You know, one of the most famous pieces of American literature, Henry David Thoreau's Walden. You know, it seems kind of quaint now. He just went out in the woods, stayed in the cabin by the lake for a couple years, but that kind of represented that yearning to be a part of nature. As we move into the latter half of the 19th century, that became a bit more formalized. You know, Yellowstone, first national park in 1872, and then it kind of picked up speed in the 20th century. So 1905, the Forestry Service is created. 2 forest rangers, Aldo Leopold and Arthur Carhart, couldn't remember the first name, came together in 1919 and drafted the first policy with regards to what wilderness might look like. 1916, of course, the National Park Service is created. And then there's a really big push post-World War II in 1945, where they're really trying to kind of push the idea of wilderness. And so in 56, a gentleman by the name of Howard Zahniser was tasked with writing the first Wilderness Act. And he had a huge impact. He was the one, for instance, who picked untrammeled. It's an 8-year process. It takes until, as I said, September 30th, 1964 to get it passed. There's thousands of hearings, dozens and dozens of drafts, and eventually it does get passed. Unfortunately, Zahniser passed away months before it was passed.
Oh, my goodness.
But his dream was realized.
Always happens that way, I feel. So later on, we get the Eastern Wilderness Act of 1976, and what's the difference between that? Why do we feel we needed it? Defining Eastern wilderness.
So there was a bit of a dispute about what met the characteristics of wilderness, and I think this is kind of a reflection of our evolving views of wilderness. You know, kind of this romantic past versions of wilderness. You know, again, there's that idea of pristine, untrampled. But as we moved in the present day, we're kind of realizing that that's romantic. That's not practical. That's not real.
Yeah.
And so this allowed us to, the Eastern Wilderness Act specifically, was kind of a recognition that areas we thought of as developed in the eastern part of the country, they could be wilderness too. And then also there were new agencies, BLM, Fish and Wildlife, who wanted to get in on protecting wilderness lands. And, you see some of the areas, Cove forests, southern Appalachian hardwood forests, and other areas in the east that had that wilderness characteristic, although taking a little bit of time in some cases.
Yeah. So what percentage or acreage of Shenandoah National Park is considered wilderness?
So roughly 80,000 acres, 40% of Shenandoah National Park is considered wilderness. A lot of that is down in the southern district.
Yeah.
But you can find trails and examples of wilderness all over the park. Some of the most popular trails, Jeremy's Run, Robertson Mountain down in Central District. If you want to go down to south, you can do any number of, Big Run, Austin Mountain. There are a lot of trails that will allow you to experience. And even in a place as, relatively speaking, small as Shenandoah National Park, you can still get a lot of variation in the characteristic of the wilderness, whether it be some of those rocky outcroppings or cove and southern Appalachian hardwood forests.
Yeah, it really is beautiful. We've got so much diversity in this park, which is great. And we're so close to large populated areas, which makes wilderness so much more accessible to some people.
Exactly.
How can visitors, talking about visitors, how can we have visitors help us preserve wilderness?
So we have a couple different ways. First, we have Leave No Trace. A lot of people are probably familiar with that. That is a set of ethics, there's 7 of them, that kind of are facets of the same idea. And so you'll see oftentimes they overlap to a certain degree. Like, getting into them, the first one is being prepared and to plan ahead. Well, the other 6 are going to be a lot easier if you take that first step. And so each of these things are kind of different ways of looking at the same idea, which is being kind to the landscape and to your fellow travelers.
Yeah.
So the second one is travel on and camp on durable surfaces. This again just reflects the idea of we want to minimize air impact, so travel on established trails, disperse your camping so you're not all trotting the same ground, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
The third, pretty self-explanatory, dispose of waste properly. One popular idea in conservation is litter begets litter. The first person who litters in an area is going to inevitably lead to other people. And it also allows us to ensure that our wildlife and other things aren't eating something they're not supposed to be eating. The fourth ethic is, of course, going to be leave what you find. The experience we have, we want others to be able to replicate.
Absolutely.
And so we want to leave artifacts, plants, rocks, whatever we find, because they bring a unique characteristic to the landscape.
Absolutely.
The fifth is going to be minimize fire impact. Again, pretty self-explanatory. I think we've all been dealing a little bit with smoke.
Yes.
So wildfires are a big thing, but even just normal campfires can have a huge impact on the landscape. And over time, having those fires and collecting firewood is going to radically change and alter the landscape.
Yeah.
Oftentimes not positively. 6 is going to be respect wildlife. Make sure you're not poking the bear, but literally and also figuratively, give animals their space and don't feed them. We don't want them to become food conditioned because that can lead to unfortunate incidents. And we also want them to maintain their wild characteristic.
Yeah.
And the 7th and final is be courteous to others. We are sharing this, and as much as we want this to be about solitude and pristine, we're a part of a group that are all sharing the same space. We all love this space. And so you want to reflect that. So don't make a lot of noise. Don't be the kind of person that destroys the landscape through the other things, and preserve it for everyone else.
Absolutely. I do think that, like we were talking about, we're so close to everywhere else. So you can see people here if you want to, enjoy a community, but you can also be in solitude. And getting to enjoy that atmosphere that you enjoyed and leaving that behind is a great feeling. Leaving stuff behind that you enjoyed and knowing that someone's going to come behind you on that trail and see the thing you just super appreciated. It's a beautiful feeling. It's a great way to experience the park.
Yeah. And if I give it just a little bit of Shenandoah flavor, we have something here called the Rocky Outcrop Management Plan. That's kind of us recognizing that here at Shenandoah National Park, we have a lot of communities that are special. Some are only found here in the state, some are only found here on Earth. And so we kind of earmarked certain areas that we want to protect. We will mark those places very carefully. And so what that means for you is just, if we ask you to stay on trail in certain areas, or we ask you not to go to certain areas, this represents less than 2% of the park's land. We're not trying to limit freedom. We just want to help protect and give a chance to our vulnerable communities, especially plants and funguses like lichen and algae.
Absolutely. So if you thought any of this was really interesting and you would love to hear way more about wilderness, we actually have Ranger Stiles in a whole video to himself going way more in depth on our YouTube page, and you can find that on Shenandoah NPS on YouTube. And speaking of our YouTube channel, I'm not seeing any comments as of right now, but no worries if you watch this late on the live stream and you have way more questions about anything we talked about, whether that be fall or the Citizen Science Project or what wilderness is. We'll be monitoring those comments and we can answer you later. So please feel free to ask whatever you want to ask. And I think that is pretty much wrapping up what we had today. So thank you so much for coming out and talking to me about wilderness.
You're welcome.
Yeah, and I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye.
Bye.
Could you repeat that website? UPS?
NPS.
NPS.